Okay, talking here.
Okay.
Oops.
Isn't this great that you can just start all over again?
I know, isn't it? We can do that in counselling session for money.
Great.
So we're here for part 2 of COVID-19 and trauma, and I'm joined by Vivienne Murtagh, our trauma therapist here in Asset. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about resources when it comes to trauma and when it comes to COVID-19. And we're here at the end of July 2020, a context when Ireland is reopening. And that's a context that's going to inform our discussion today. Before we get into talking about resources and what resources we have when it comes to trauma, I just wanted to share a little quote to give us a context that's quite important to think about. It's this quote here from Dr. Maria Paredes, and she says, "Trauma-informed therapy is important, but social justice-informed therapy is even more important. One cannot truly do fully trauma-informed therapy without understanding the trauma of social injustice." So Vivienne, as somebody who's a trauma therapist and who is somebody who has worked in particular with individuals who've been impacted by social injustice, whatever we might mean by that term, what does that quote mean for you?
Okay, if I look at it personally, thinking of how I've been traumatized in the pandemic, I have to say very little, because trauma is not actually what happens, it's how we respond to the event. And if I think of the work of Albert Wong, he talks about one of the first stages of resourcing for trauma is to have protective figures, to have a safe place, to have wise figures, to have nurturing figures. I've had a safe place. I live in the countryside. I have beautiful views. I live with somebody who's nurturing and somebody who's protective. When I think of some of our clients in Acid, their lives are the opposite experience. They're living in small apartments. They have children who are struggling with neurodiversity. They may have oppressive partners. They just do not have the resources of protection, of wisdom, of safety in the home that they work in or live in. And we are all part of what happens to help us through a trauma is co-regulation. And if you're living with someone who just doesn't get you or doesn't want to get you, and in fact is abusive of you, that's where I think the social injustice picture comes in.
Yeah, and
so some of the resources that are available to me are not naturally available to others. But one of the resources, which we'll talk about later, that's available to all of us, is breath. That we can learn how to do some breathing, and I'm saying that, and I'm saying this is a resource, and I would be saying we come to that with curiosity and with compassion and with tenderness. But a lot of people who are within a social justice model would have to go through an awful long process to get to the place where they could be compassionate with themselves, because one of the underlying messages possibly would be a shame message, which isn't compatible with compassion initially.
And I think that it's a very important context, I suppose, as we delve a little bit deeper into resources. And we really wanted to name it here. We know that there's even a danger, even a harm that can be done of expecting resources to be there and available for all, and that the cause is our inability. The cause of our problems is our inability to get them and use them. But actually, there's deeper underlying things we could analyze all day long, and even what that term social injustice means, and all kinds of things to do with wealth disparity and access to resources. So it's important we name that, because it's a context that informs how we bring out resources, and that we avoid even, what Oscar Wilde said is that the worst slave owners were the ones who are kind to their slaves. And so we have to be cautious as we step into this. But we will do that, and let's think about resources a little bit more. You mentioned breathing, and the last day you shared with us a tip and pacing your breathing. But I know you want to delve a little bit deeper into resources, because we named social justice because there is a danger of shaming people when it comes to their maybe inability, to use one word, to access resources. But I know you want to talk a little bit more about shame itself.
To say if only I had been able to is guilt, and we can make amends for that. whereas shame is I am. It's not a behavior. It's something to do with who I am. I am insufficient. I'm diminished. It's the self-judging of the self. And I don't think we're born feeling shame. It's a learned phenomena. It's a relational phenomena. It's got to do with not only what our caregivers say to us, but got to do with what society says to us. So shame has got to do with who I am. And we have to be really careful. We never shame people. And as I say, it's relational. There's nothing much we can do about shame except reframe it. And if we reframe shame as a resource rather than who you are, I think that helps. And if we shame as a resource, I'll say something about that in a second, then we can shift it into the realm of guilt. And when we have it in the realm of guilt, then we can do something about it. We can sort of make some sort of amends. So that's the journey of shame. Shame is who we are. And I think it's Judith Herman, I'm not sure, it's Judith Herman or Pat Ogden, who talks about shame is like anxiety. It functions as a signal of danger. It's interpersonal. And again, as we said it just now, it's social. And it protects people. So if we reframe it as a survival resource, if you think just now, before this is just coming off the top of my head, if you think just now, before we started, I had a coughing fit. But say I was in a room and I started to cough, I would start to feel there's something wrong with me. I'm going to give these people COVID, or people will think I have. And so what I do is I either leave the room, I go into a corner in the room, I make myself smaller, I hunch myself up. I do all of those things, and that's what we do with shame. And so shame is a resource to help me look after myself, to make myself smaller in a situation where I would feel terrible. And that is how shame has worked as a resource for many, many of our clients. They work against gravity. They hunch their shoulders up. They pull themselves in, and so then you're not able even to take what is one of the natural resources, a big breath, and sometimes even encouraging someone who is in this hunched up, hanging from above position, can't even take a breath. So that's a resource that may not even be available to them until they start doing very gentle body work and come into themselves a little bit. Does that answer that about shame a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Richard. I was going to say, can I just speak for a moment about Stephen Porges and his work? Because his work is very useful with shame and trauma. You probably know who he is. He shifted our thinking, our conceptualization of the whole nervous system. He came up with this word, neuroception. You probably know it. It's where he's saying it's not our mind, but it's our nervous system, not our cortex, but our nervous system that's discerning life threat, that's discerning danger, the pandemic. You walk into a room and I'm coughing. Suddenly there's a life threat, and triggers maybe something else in you as well. So trauma triggers trauma. And so the pandemic is a real example of neuroception. If we walk into a store and people are not wearing a mask, we feel not safe. And then once we discern by our nervous system that it's safe, we go in, and it's our nervous system, our body that works first. Because if you think of the example of falling down the stairs, if I was tripping or falling down the stairs, I don't think, oh gosh, I'm tripping, I'd better put my hands out and save myself. My brain goes offline and my body works, and I just grab something. So the neuroception, he says that what happens is that the ventral vagal system is stimulated. The branch of the vagus nerve that looks after the face, which tells us eye contact, tone of voice, vocalization. And when that part of us, that part of the ventral vagal system realizes that it's safe, then I smile at the security guy at the shop, realize that everybody's got a mask, and on I go. If we intercept danger, it's not the ventral vagal system that comes on board, it's the sympathetic nervous system that's stimulated. Arousal shoots up to activate what we're going to cover this conversation earlier with, activates our instinctive defenses: fight, flight, freeze, cross for help. And so we intercept we intercept threat, and there's no way to fight back. There's no way to flee. Then the dorsal vagal is stimulated, and the unmyelinated branch of the vagus comes online, and it slows everything down, and we get spacey, and we get faint. And so that's where chronic shame is, in the hypoarousal, in the dorsal vagal. And that's where we make ourselves, which is a very strange thing, because there's tonic immobility and collapse immobility. And tonic immobility is the deer in the headlights, where there's frozen but alert. Collapse is numb and dissociated. And it's probably somewhere in the tonic immobility, because somebody who's feeling the shame is alert to danger at the same time. And so that's why this ventral vagal polyvagal theory is so useful. And people who have been abused, who've been in submissive, who've been in dominant relationships, who have no hope of fighting back or getting away, move into shame, move into hypo. And that is so many of our clients in their situation at the moment. They can't get out, they can't fight back. And so they go into deer in the headlights, or else they go numb and dissociated. And so many people are there at the moment, especially if they're coming from this social injustice system. Does that make sense, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think are, in the context of reopening and COVID-19, you've given the example of, going to a shop and feeling fear and danger in terms of virus transmission, but in the bigger picture of us moving from a place of being quarantined even in some ways for months and moving out, where do you see trauma and shame played out in some of those settings?
Well, I've been thinking about this, because I have felt a little bits of, now in the end I've realized that when I think it's shame, it's not actually shame, it's guilt. But because we all have shame and trauma somewhere inside us, it goes into that. And just learning, when I say I've gone into a shop and I've done this without a mask on, and I look around and everybody's got a mask on, and I feel that everybody's looking at me, and I want to make myself smaller, and I feel shame, realizing that that's not actually shame, that's guilt. But it's touching into a trigger of mine, of where I felt shame before, by people looking at me, or people thinking I was less than, or people judging me. And moving that to guilt, and saying, okay, I'm going to leave the shop now and I'm going to go get myself a mask. That's just a very simple one. But realizing as well that when we get these feelings, the turtle response, pulling our head in, we get these sensations, we get these catastrophizing thoughts. So if I go in there without a mask, I'm going to die, or I might get sick, and if that happens, I'll lose my job. Being aware of those sensations and normalizing them, and realizing they are just triggers. And a trigger is a somatic response to stimulus that the body has in the nervous system. Instead of saying, I wish I hadn't gone out without a mask, and going into a whole story after that, just saying I was triggered there. And that works actually at home as well, which is a whole other story. But often I could say, I wish my husband hadn't said that, I wish he hadn't done that. And then I go off on one, and I get dysregulated and I get overwhelmed, just to say I've just been triggered. That sort of helps. So if we can do that. But when something, can I talk a little bit more, Richard, about the vagus nerve there for a second? And just in a sort of junior cert piece of it, this vagus nerve, I didn't describe it. It comes from the ninth cranial nerve. I think we talked about this before. And it goes down through the whole body. And it connects with most of the organs below the diaphragm, and with the heart and the lungs. And beneath the diaphragm, it's non-myelinated. So that's why we feel everything in our tummy. So something horrible happens in the pandemic. We go back to work and have to come home again. We go out without a mask. Somebody coughs on us, whatever. And our tummy turns. this vagus nerve that's winding through our body. And it's called vagus because it comes from vagabond, which comes from a Latin word called vagar, or vagabundus. It takes this information from our gut and it relays it back up to our brain. And so we need to uncouple it, because it goes to our brain, it tells us a story, it winds back down into our tummy, goes back up and down in very, very short period of time, like milliseconds. And something that can help interrupt that feedback loop that's coming from our belly up to our brain, is a breath. And this is Peter Levine working with Stephen Porges, and they've come up with this idea, and I'm not going to do it fully because you'll think I've frozen, it'll take all our time. This VU breath, and anybody can do a VU breath. And a VU breath it's a full, soft, easy breath with a long exhale. You let out the VU sound. I'll just do a tiny piece of it, okay? I do. Now, it can bring up some feelings, it can bring up some images, but actually it breaks that feedback loop. And I've known people who, through the pandemic, and talking to someone yesterday, where this VU breath has saved their lives, they think. They just feel overwhelmed, and they've gone into the place of overwhelm outside their window of tolerance. They remember the VU breath. The big thing is remembering it, because if you remember, you've gone offline at this point. Just remembering VU. It's so small. But that VU breath, if I'd done it, Richard, would have just lasted forever. It takes so long to get that breath out. And when you're doing it, the inside of you shakes. And the image that comes to my mind is like a didgeridoo. And it's a didgeridoo sound inside. And it just stops when it's finished. You don't stop it. I stopped it there, but you stop it when it finishes. And it lasts for ages. It's not like a breath in. It's not like.
Great. Thanks, Vivienne.
It's a resource.
It is a resource.
We should do it together and co-regulate each other, Richard.
We should. I was wondering, just to finish up though, because we need to wrap up, and we want to hear more from you, is how can we support one another as a resource to one another? Some of these are resources we take on as individuals, and that's be very useful. But as we're reopening, we're starting to connect with other people a little bit more, as well as those we were living with for months indoors. How can we be a resource to one another in the context of trauma and COVID-19?
This is interesting, Richard, because things have opened up and I'm seeing people in a social distance context. And I actually have felt more resourced on Zoom with them because I'm closer. I'm not nervous. I haven't gone offline. My hippocampus hasn't gone offline. I'm fully online on Zoom, and Zoom has been a brilliant co-regulating resource. I just think it's fabulous. And so opening up is very, very difficult because there's this, gosh, his name's gone from me. You know who I'm talking about, the German philosopher who talks about the space between. In the space between us right here on Zoom, there is no anxiety. There is no lack of safety. There is no threat. When I go into my living room and a visitor comes in, the space between us is full of a little bit of threat. And I think we need to name it. We need to talk about it. And we need to find what we started off saying with Albert Wong. We need to find safe places where we can be. We need to be in gardens. We need to be in bigger rooms. We need wise figures to say, yeah, you're okay here. This is honestly, and we need nurturing figures to look after us. They can't hug us, but they can look at us across the room with a beam gleam. And if someone just catches your eye, that can make an awful difference because we can't hug anymore. And we need to have protective figures in our lives. That's where we started, Richard.
Great. Thanks so much, Vivienne. That's been wonderful. We're going to leave it at that. But in all those resources, I think there's so much. And we have the chance to reflect on them again. But thank you.
Let's, as we finish, do the VU breath together, and then you can switch us off. So a soft, full, and just see how long it goes afterwards. You'll still be doing it long after we're gone. A soft, full belly, and then a VU. VU.